In my last video, I said that today I would be back in London and that it would be back to normal in terms of my programs. Well, as you can see, I am indeed back in London on this wet and dismal day following Keir Starmer's election victory, about which more shortly. But unfortunately, it is not quite business as normal, as often happens when I've been away. There's been a mountain of things to sort out, and that unfortunately means, or perhaps some would say fortunately means, that this video is again going to be somewhat shorter than some of the other videos, some of the videos that I more normally do. Anyway, let's start with that British election. I said that it is a dismal day in London. It is overcast. There's rain, sometimes quite heavy rain. It makes a sharp difference to that day back in May 1997, which I so well remember, the day after Tony Blair was elected Prime Minister in a landslide victory, which basically set the broad contours that British politics has followed ever since. Back in 1997, there was huge euphoria, as I remember, on the part of many people at the prospect of a Labour government after 18 years of Conservative rule. I, by the way, though a long-standing Labour supporter, did not share in that enthusiasm. I made sure to absent myself by going to Greece so as to avoid being in London on election day. But anyway, there was huge euphoria, enormous sense of optimism about the change of government, and Blair himself was a massively popular figure. Well, this time it is different, despite the fact that Keir Starmer's majority is even bigger than Blair's was in 1997. Now, let's go over the results, and I think that they are, in some respects, most interesting. The first thing to say is that the election turnout back in 1997 was over 70%. In this election, the election that has taken place in Britain just now, the one that took place yesterday, election turnout was 59.9%. That is the second lowest that Britain has experienced since the end of the Second World War. In fact, I think you would have to go back to a time before the extensions of the suffrage to find a time when fewer people in Britain, a smaller proportion of the population in Britain, voted in an election than this one, probably back to a time before the First World War. That's a guess, by the way, not an absolute certainty. Anyway, Blair won his landslide with 42% of the vote, which was perhaps less than what one might have expected, given the size of that landslide, but reflected the scale of the Conservative collapse. The Conservatives, as I remember, won around 27% of the vote in 1997, which was a historic low for them. Well, in the election that has just happened, Keir Starmer's Labour Party won 33% of the vote, 9 points below what Blair achieved in 1997, and only 1% more than what was achieved by Jeremy Corbyn when he led the Labour Party to defeat in the election that took place 5 years ago in 2019. So, in terms of percentage of the vote, this is the lowest percentage of the vote that a winning party has won in circumstances where it ends up with a majority that I or anyone else in Britain can remember, and which has been true, I think, in British electoral politics. But in some ways, the results are even more interesting than that, because I've been going back looking at the figures, and I'm looking not so much at percentages of voters who have voted Labour and percentages of voters who've participated in the election, but I have looked at actual numbers of voters who have supported the Labour Party in the three most recent elections. And I find that in 2017, when Labour was led by Keir Starmer's predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, Labour won 12.8 million votes. In 2019, when Labour was led also by Keir Starmer's predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, Labour won 10.2 million votes. And in this election, which has just taken place, apparently, according to the figures that I have, Labour won just 9.6 million votes. So a steady decline, a decline since the peak in 2017. Labour lost in 2017 and lost again in 2019, but it won this election with fewer votes than the votes it achieved in 2017 and 2019. Now, I say that, I ought to say that I have read in the Daily Telegraph that in this election, the one that's just passed, Labour actually won 900,000 more votes than Jeremy Corbyn won in 2019. I've not seen any other place which comes up with that number. And on the very low turnout in 2019, by the way, was 67.3% as opposed to 59.9% in the election that has just happened. I think that what the Daily Telegraph's saying is statistically impossible. Just saying. But anyway, I throw that in because that is what the Daily Telegraph is saying. In my opinion, the results are clear. Labour has won a landslide, despite the fact that it is, in terms of its popularity, a declining force. It is becoming less popular, not more popular, since its peak, the peak that it achieved in 2017. And why has this happened? Well, the answer is very, very simple, because of a complete collapse in support for the formerly governing Conservative Party. Now, again, let's just go over some figures. In 2017, when Theresa May just outvoted Jeremy Corbyn and remained Prime Minister, the Theresa May-led Conservative Party won 13.6 million votes. In 2019, when Boris Johnson won a sweeping victory with a majority of 80 on a promise of getting Brexit done, and with the support, the help during the election of none other than Nigel Farage, the Conservatives won 13.9 million votes. In the election that has just happened, the Conservative vote has crashed to 6.8 million. Their vote has almost halved. It's been a huge implosion. And the reason it has halved is not actually difficult to work out. Briefly, the Conservative Party, in my opinion, has never fully found its footing ever since back in 1990. Its long-time leader and Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was ousted by an internal party coup. Now, in saying that, let me make it very clear that I was not a supporter of Margaret Thatcher while she was Prime Minister, that I disagreed profoundly with the policies that she was pursuing as Prime Minister, and that I still think today that much of what she did was a great leap in the wrong direction. But those are my views. The point to say about Margaret Thatcher is that, putting aside personal opinions about her, she was a formidable political figure, a tremendous political force. She dominated politics. She had a clear vision, even if it was one that not all of us agreed with, and was a person of very considerable political skills who commanded a critical mass of support within the British Conservative electorate. No one else, no Conservative leader that has followed has come anywhere close to matching the kind of position that she had. And none has presented or articulated the kind of vision and ambitions that she also had as Conservative leader. And I would add that the manner of her removal in 1990 had the effect, in my opinion, of replacing politics as it was historically conducted in Britain, politics in which governments and prime ministers were made and unmade by British voters in elections, by the new system that has existed ever since, when politics and prime ministers and governments are made and unmade, not through so much through elections, but rather through all kinds of conspiracies and manipulations and plots and such things, of which we have seen an almost unending series since Thatcher's ouster in 1990, replacing, if you like, old-fashioned democratic politics with something quite different and far more controlled. And it's important to say that after Thatcher's ouster, the Conservative Party never really recovered. As I said, it crashed 20%, 27% of the vote in 1997. It regained power in 2010 against an unpopular Labour government, but was unable to win a clear majority and had to go into coalition with the Liberals. And this only as a result of the massive financial crisis that had taken place in 2008, which derailed the Labour Party's economic programme. And ever since then, ever since it regained power in 2010, the Conservative government has always had that quality of looking somehow transient and temporary, of not really having a clear sense of what it was all about. It's moved from one policy line to another. It's gone from one trajectory to another, and it has never really formed a convincing or remotely successful government. And the result is economic stagnation, lack of productivity growth, a succession of prime ministers, Cameron, Johnson, May, Truss, who, by the way, lost a seat in this election, and of course Sunak, none of them ultimately convincing figures, and everything that was started somehow left undone, including first and foremost Brexit itself, which is perhaps the one issue around which the Conservative Party might have united and could have found created a new programme around, but which in the end it never did. So this is why the Conservative Party has crashed it has never really provided a truly convincing explanation to the British people of why it governs, because it has no real sense of direction any longer, and in my opinion has not done so ever since the removal of Thatcher all those decades ago. And by the way, the same is increasingly true of the Labour Party. The Labour Party has won this election with this enormous landslide, because even though it is unpopular, it's hardly done better than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2019. Nonetheless, it's still there. It's not blamed for failures in office in the way that the Conservatives are. And the result is, because of the eccentricities of the electoral system and through sheer momentum, or if you like, more inertia maybe than the momentum, simply because it is there, it has benefited disproportionately from the Conservative collapse. And the same is true, by the way, of the other traditional party, establishment party in British politics, the Liberal Democrats, who on 12% of the vote have suddenly increased the number of their MPs to over 70, simply because, again, they are benefiting disproportionately from the Conservative collapse. And that leaves us in a situation in Britain where we can see clearly that the British are deeply disillusioned with their political class, feel that it is unconvincing, they don't trust the Labour Party very much and have little belief in it. And it's unsurprising, given that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer had little to offer in terms of a programme, but they didn't like the Conservatives. They were determined to get the Conservatives out of power. So by default, we've ended with Labour. This is not a sustainable political position. A country that is so completely disillusioned with its political class, as Britain has become, is not going to be able to continue along the current trajectory for much longer. Just as the Conservatives have just experienced a sudden and dramatic collapse, there's every possibility that in a future election, maybe even in the next election, Labour will experience exactly the same. And the Liberals too, and all of the other parties in the establishment. Now, it would not be true to say that in this election the British were deprived of all choices. Reform UK, a very right-wing party by British standards, seeking strong immigration controls, clamp down on crime, and strongly pro-free market economic policies, has emerged as a significant force. Its leader, Nigel Farage, has now been elected to Parliament, and there's 3 other MPs as well, including Tice, who was the leader of the party before Farage basically took control of it over the course of this current election campaign. Many people are asking why a party that wins 14% of the vote only gets 4 MPs, whereas the Liberals, who won 12% of the vote, get over 70. I'm not going to explain in this programme the eccentricities of the British electoral system, but suffice to say it is structured to benefit established parties rather than new ones. And the fact that Reform UK has been able to break into the British Parliament and win seats at all is, to anybody who is familiar with British history and British politics, a significant achievement in itself. Anyway, Reform UK is clearly a party to watch. Perhaps the Greens might be also, they are, to the extent that there is an alternative on the left, they're starting to emerge as one. The new party, the Workers' Party, which basically tried to revive the old traditions of the original Labour Party, the Labour Party that I remember and once was a member of, the one that effectively Tony Blair killed. Well, anyway, that party has only been in existence a relatively short time. It gained 200,000 votes. It's failed to make a significant impact in this election. And as I understand it, George Galloway, its leader, failed to gain re-election in Rochdale, where he had been elected MP before in the recent by-election. I have to say that I think this election came much too quickly for that party to organise itself properly, and I think also the way it campaigned, it made certain significant mistakes. I'm not sure what its future is as a political force. Just saying. But anyway, we will see. Maybe at some point an alternative on the left will emerge. There is, as I said, in the shape of Reform UK, now a clear alternative on the right. But the big story here is that none of the parties, except perhaps to some extent Reform UK, actually proposed a programme which people felt, or a critical mass of people felt in Britain, addressed the great problems that concern people in Britain most. The stagnating economy, the deterioration in the current financial position of the government, the ongoing controversial issue of immigration into Britain, which continues at a very high rate, unabated. The conflict in Ukraine, that none of the parties and none of the party leaders, except Nigel Farage, and by the way, George Galloway, had anything much to say about. Other questions like that also. The policies of the outgoing, discredited, destroyed Conservative Party, which is now, it seems to me, in an existential moment, are not that different from those of the new Labour Party that is just going to form a government. So, a situation where nobody's offering, none of the major parties are offering real solutions to the problems that Britain has, or maybe not real solutions, but at least serious solutions to the problems that Britain has, that none of the parties have clear conception of how to proceed and go forward, where administration, in effect, is all that is being offered. Administration in place of government. Well, as I said, I don't think that this is a viable system. Sooner or later, it's going to start to break down, and I'm not going to try to guess what form that breakdown will take. Only I hope that it will be orderly and peaceful. By the way, the expression administration in place of government was first used to describe the situation in the last decades of the old Habsburg Empire in the run-up to the First World War. And as we know, that empire eventually collapsed. So when we are in a situation where there is only administration rather than government, which is the situation Britain is in today, well, the outlook cannot be good. Now, Britain is the first of 3 countries to go through a significant political change. Though, as I said, this particular political change, which we have seen in Britain, is basically the perpetuation of a discredited and deeply unpopular status quo. On Sunday, we have elections in France. And I've discussed in recent programs how all of the parties in France, apart from the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen, seem to be coming together with one objective, which is to prevent the Rassemblement National from winning a majority in the French Parliament on Sunday. Now, note the curiosity of this, because in Britain, Keir Starmer is now Prime Minister with a colossal majority achieved on 33% of the vote, whereas Marine Le Pen in France is likely to be denied a majority, though her party won exactly the same percentage of the vote as Keir Starmer, 33% of the vote in the first round of the French elections. In fact, it's highly likely that Marine Le Pen and her party will be deprived of a majority, even though she's most likely going to win a bigger percentage of the vote on a higher turnout than Keir Starmer has won in the British election, where he's ended up with his thumping majority. Marine Le Pen, in other words, is a significantly more popular and more supported figure in France than Keir Starmer is in Britain. Just saying. And that, it seems to me, points again to the nature of politics in the West today. The system, and one I think is justified in talking about a system, is more interested in its own self-perpetuation than it is in delivering democratic change. So the result is that a system politician like Keir Starmer, well, the whole electoral and political structures in Britain work in his favour. So even though he's not very popular and has no vision, he ends up with a gigantic majority. Whereas in France, Marine Le Pen, who is what the Russians would call a non-system politician, well, it looks as if, even though she's more popular than Starmer is, and more widely supported in France than Starmer is in Britain, well, it's likely that she's going to be denied a majority. And I'm going to suggest that this is every bit as unsustainable in France as the outcome that we see in Britain. In Britain, though a discredited establishment simply continues to tread water and maintain itself in power, in what is starting increasingly to look like the simulacrum of politics rather than its reality. In France, we're going to have an equally unsustainable situation where, again, with a crisis in immigration, or one at least that many people believe is a crisis in immigration, with a deterioration of the public finances, with financial pressures on ordinary people. In other words, with the same set of problems that we have in Britain, we are likely to end up with an outcome, again, where there is no strong government and where administration has in effect replaced government. So even though the outcome of the elections in Britain and France on surface appearances might be completely different, a government with a vast majority in Britain and a parliament with a government with no majority in France, in fact and in reality, the crisis is the same. Problems building up on every side, but with no real policy, no real centre able to lead. Instead, administration replacing government. And who can deny that that is the situation we have today in the United States? Because we've seen the same thing happen with President Biden. We've seen how he's, ever since the disastrous electoral debate that he had with his opponent just under a week ago now, we've seen how his position is imploding. The talk at the moment is that after a brief seeming stabilization, the party donors, the major donors to his campaign, are now again starting to have doubts, and it seems that there's many others who are having doubts also, and that there's pressures now to remove, to persuade the president to stand down and to announce that he's not going to be a candidate for the presidency in the election in November. Well, who can doubt that in practice, in the United States, also, what we now have is administration rather than government. Problems piling up, a president unable to run things, perhaps likely to step down any day now. Decisions not being made through the electoral process. I spoke about how in Britain the electoral process has ceased to have the central importance that it once did. And in France, we can see almost the same thing with all sorts of strange coalitions and arrangements being put together to stop non-system politicians coming through and forming a government again. Anyway, who can doubt that we are in the same sort of situation in the United States? Because if the president does stand down, he will be replaced presumably by his vice president, either as candidate or perhaps inheriting the presidential office. I don't think anybody believes that Kamala Harris has the political strength or authority to provide the United States with a strong government through all the various crises that it is experiencing. And one way or the other, it looks as if the bureaucracy that governs the United States will continue to continue to do so. And again, for the moment at least, we have administration instead of government. And again, as in the case in Britain, and as is the case in France, we see how the whole system is arranging itself to prevent the non-system politician, in this case Donald Trump, from being elected to office. How he's had to face off a whole series, a whole unending succession of court and legal challenges, of how he's having to battle through, and how even if he wins, it is far from being a foregone conclusion that he will be in actual control. He could quite plausibly find himself in office, but not in power. So that, it seems to me, is the problem of the West. Now, contrast that with what is going on elsewhere. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this vast, well, it's difficult to know quite what to call it. Is it a club of countries? Or is it some kind of structure? Or is it an alliance even? Anyway, this group of countries that very intentionally and knowing exactly what it is doing are keeping the precise nature of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as undefined as possible have just had an important summit in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan. And Putin was there, and Xi Jinping was there, and many other leaders. Lukashenko, Belarus was there, and Tokayev, of course, of Kazakhstan was hosting the meeting, and Erdogan, the Turkish president, was there, and many other leaders were there also. And I think it's fair to say that even though Xi Jinping represents what is indisputably the most powerful country attending the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Astana, and though there is no doubt also that he made some extremely interesting and important contributions in his public comments. Nonetheless, the person who everybody wanted to hear and everybody wanted to meet was none other than President Putin of Russia. And it's not difficult again to understand why, because in what most of the world now sees as a global confrontation between the new system which is being set up in Eurasia and which is seen as the foundation of the new multipolar system, the confrontation between this grouping and the West, it is President Putin of Russia, and indeed Russia, that is at the vanguard on the Eurasian side in that confrontation. It is they who are involved in the proxy war with the West in Ukraine, and it is they who are chairing the BRICS and are preparing for this key summit meeting in Kazan in September, and it is they who are at least publicly floating all these various ideas and telling us the direction that events are taking. Now, Putin was very, very busy whilst he was at Astana. He met all sorts of people. He had a very interesting and very long and in-depth meeting with Erdogan of Turkey. These two leaders have not always got on very well, to put it mildly. In fact, there's been many rumours that at a personal level, they don't entirely like each other, and they certainly don't trust each other. But, as sometimes happens, two leaders who may not be the best of friends have managed to work very effectively and successfully with each other over the course of time. And it was interesting to see that obviously Erdogan and Putin had much to say on economics questions, on the conflict in Ukraine, though I should say neither of them said anything especially new about the conflict in Ukraine. But these two leaders also discussed the Middle East. They discussed at considerable length the unfinished business of the Syrian war, and I got the clear impression that President Putin and President Erdogan have now finally taken a decision that the Syrian war must be brought to an end, that President Assad of Syria must continue to lead the country, and that he and his government must be restored to complete control of the entirety of Syrian territory, including the Kurdish areas in the east of Syria, where the United States has an uninvited military presence. And I suspect that this on again, off again topic of the summit meeting between Assad and Erdogan is now back on the agenda, and I suspect that at some point, probably in the next few months, we will get a final settlement of the war in Syria between Syria and Turkey, and one which will place impossibly intense pressures on the United States and might, for all I know, lead to the eventual withdrawal of American forces from Syria. Now, note that the Turks and the Russians, but also all of the other countries at Astana, they issued a communique in which they spoke of the importance of having all the territory of Eurasia, finally having all foreign troops leave this territory once and for all. The word Taiwan is not mentioned in conjunction with this, but of course, one of the places in Eurasia, one of the territories which all of the members of the SCO agree is part of the SCO, which is Taiwan, which is, as far as all the SCO states are concerned, a part of China. Well, Taiwan is one place, for example, where American soldiers are known to be located, and we see that this communique says that they must all go. Anyway, a very interesting meeting at the SCO, as I said, discussing many topics, economic and otherwise. Putin talking at length about the importance of the new security structure for Eurasia, which the Russians are now talking about. Most of the SCO states clearly on side with this. Certainly China appears to be. And Putin is, of course, going to be discussing this same topic with a most important visitor who's coming to Moscow on the 8th of July. This person is, of course, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Many have sought to explain Modi's decision not to come to Astana as involving some kind of snub. India was represented at the SCO summit by India's extremely capable Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar. But my own view is that there's actually a very simple reason why Modi chose not to go to Astana and was content to leave it to Jaishankar to represent India there. And this is precisely the fact that Modi is travelling to Moscow on the 8th of July. And I said that Putin is the person that everybody wants to meet and to be seen with. And Modi clearly wants that meeting with Putin to take the character of a one-to-one summit meeting, an important summit meeting spaced out over several days. So he wants to avoid a situation where he's meeting Putin twice in a couple of days, once in Astana and once in Moscow. And he didn't want to meet Putin at a time when there were lots of other meetings with all sorts of other leaders, which might have taken away some of the emphasis from the meeting with Putin, which is about to take place. But I am sure that the relationship between India and Russia, which, as far as I'm concerned, appears to be rock solid, will continue to develop as a result of Modi's visit to Russia. And I am also sure that Modi will provide quiet support to the stance that Vladimir Putin is taking on the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, Putin had a lot to say about the conflict in Ukraine whilst he was in Astana. He talked about the fact that the Russians remain fully prepared for negotiations and always have been. They've never rejected negotiations. He talked about the lack of good faith on the part of Russia's Ukrainian and Western interlocutors on the question of the conflict in Ukraine. He said that imposing unilateral and impossible conditions on Russia is, in effect, a path to nowhere. It simply prolongs the war. He again reiterated many of the principles upon which the Russians would want to see this conflict end. And he said very importantly that the Russians will not simply agree to a ceasefire because the Ukrainians say they want to sit down to talk, that the Russians have been tricked, as he put it, that way before, that they previously agreed to ceasefires or to stand downs. They pulled all their troops from the area of Kiev, for example, when they thought that the Istanbul Agreement had been all but signed and agreed, and that they're not going to let themselves be put into that position again. If Ukraine wants a ceasefire, then Putin has set out the conditions very clearly. He has said that the Ukrainians must withdraw from all of the 4 regions. They must pull out all their troops out of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, and then a ceasefire can take place, and at that point serious negotiations can begin. Well, I know this is an unpopular stance with many people in the West, but my sense is that overall, in most of the world, people understand it and increasingly are coming round to the view that it is the way forward. It is the only way in which this conflict can be resolved diplomatically. Now, there is one other person who I think thinks the same, and that is Prime Minister Orban of Hungary. Now, Orban is now in the position of being president, of having assumed the presidency of the European Union. There is, alongside the situation of the president of the European Council, who is of course Charles Michel, there is also a rotating presidency of the European Union, whereby one particular country assumes overall responsibility and leadership for the process in all of the various institutions. And over the next 6 months, it will be Hungary. And perhaps in reliance upon that, Prime Minister Orban has recently visited Kiev, where, as I said, he's tried to talk some sense into President Zelensky, suggesting that the Ukrainians themselves announce a unilateral ceasefire, a suggestion which the Ukrainians absolutely rejected. But to the shock and horror and dismay of all the leading figures in the European Union, Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, several European governmental leaders, the European Commission. Anyway, to the shock of all of these people, Prime Minister Orban has gone to Moscow, where he is currently in talks with President Putin. Now, I have to say, I understand that Prime Minister Orban is not a person that European leaders, at least West European leaders, tend to like very much. And that's putting it mildly. And I understand that they've all become very fixated with Project Ukraine, and that the idea that Orban, of all people, should be going to Moscow and negotiating with Putin over the question of Ukraine is one that many European leaders will therefore find deeply offensive. But I have to point out again the absurdity of the position, the stance that they are taking. We have had a peace summit in Switzerland that ended in total failure, even the Western media now accepts this because the Russians were not there. We've had President Zelensky himself admit that in any future summit meeting to discuss a resolution of the crisis in Ukraine, the Russians this time must be there. We've had comments from the man who might quite plausibly become the next president of the United States, Donald Trump, talk about the fact that he's got a plan to end the war in Ukraine. Putin spoke quite courteously about those words of Trump's whilst he was in Astana. Anyway, we see that the Americans might eventually be edging towards entering into some kind of discussion with the Russians about the conflict in Ukraine. We see the demand from most of the world community for discussions about ending the conflict in Ukraine. And what do we see from the Europeans? Shock, horror, when the country that has assumed the presidency of the European Union decides that in light of all of this and of the deteriorating situation on the front lines, the right thing to do is to go to Moscow, meet with the Russians, discuss the situation with Putin, find out what the Russians are actually thinking, and see whether some common ground can be found. What people are objecting to is the traditional exercise of diplomacy. It is astounding that at a time when the war is being lost, when Europe is going through a prolonged economic crisis, and I'm not going to discuss the situation in Germany where I have just been in this program, but I will return to it in future programs. Well, at a time like this, there is shock, horror, hand-wringing, statements of condemnation because a European leader finally grasps the nettle and goes to Moscow and tries to find out from the Russians what it is that they really think and whether the prospect for negotiations actually does, in fact, exist. Now, all of this is rendered even more urgent by the situation on the front lines, on the battle lines in Ukraine. And briefly, it is to this topic that I now intend to turn. President Zelensky has now recently made a comment. He said that there are 14 brigades of the Ukrainian army now in reserve, presumably made up of recently mobilized men. And the problem is that Ukraine can't attack with them because the West is not providing Ukraine with all the weapons and ammunition and equipment and machinery and aircraft and tanks and rockets and missiles and all of the unending shopping list of military supplies that President Zelensky says Ukraine needs. Now, 14 brigades may sound like a lot, but a Ukrainian brigade can number between 2,000 men and 4,000 men, depending on its size, well, not just its size, but on its relative importance. Now, that means that we're talking about a reserve that might number somewhere between 30 and 60,000 men. Now, Ukraine, according to the Russians, is now losing between 1,500 to 2,000 men a day, dead and wounded. So this reserve that President Zelensky is talking about is just enough to make up for 1 month's losses. Just saying. So it may sound impressive. In fact, and in practice, it is not anywhere near as impressive as it sounds. It looks to me, once again, simply another device by President Zelensky to say, well, look, we are fully committed to the war. We can go on fighting. We will go on fighting. We will win. Only The only problem, the only thing that is holding us back is that you're not giving us the weapons that we need in order to win. And, well, Ukraine is not winning. It continues to lose, and it continues to lose badly. Now, I'm going to go through a brief rundown, a very brief rundown of the state of the war as of now. From what I understand, in Volchansk, we seem to have crossed the tipping point. The Russians group of forces north continues to clear the area of the high-rise buildings, and they've now started an outflanking operation round Volchansk, and it looks like the Ukrainians, far from going on the offensive in the Kharkiv area, are likely to lose Volchansk at some point within the next few weeks. In Siversk, further south, it looks as if the Russians are now closing in from Siversk from the south and east. They've captured Belogorovka and Sporny in the east. They've captured Razdolovka and have apparently now almost reached Vinka from the south. It looks as if this thorn in the side of the Russians, which Siversk has represented ever since the fighting in 2022 in the north of Donbass, that this thorn in the side is about to be pulled. Now, further south still, in Chasiv Yar, the Russians, having captured the micro-district, perhaps the most heavily fortified position in Chasiv Yar, are now reorganizing and reinforcing, but there's every prospect that in the next couple of days or weeks, the offensive on Chasiv Yar will resume, and I don't think anybody seriously expects that the Ukrainians will be able to hold the Russians back. Further south still, in the Toretsk area, the Russians have broken through all the biggest defense lines that the Ukrainians have created around this town of Toretsk. It seems that now the greater part of the town of New York, the village of New York, part of the Toretsk conurbation, may have fallen under Russian control. And, well, the Russians clearly hold the initiative in this area as well. In the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area, the place where this great gaping hole in the Ukrainian defense lines has been created, the reports are that the Ukrainians have now abandoned Yevgenivka completely, opening up the way for the Russians to attack the village of Progress. That puts them within comfortable artillery range of the major Ukrainian urban center and supply base of Pokrovsk, and it looks like the battle for Pokrovsk itself is about to begin, with no sign that the Ukrainians have any effective defense lines in this area at all. And further south still, the Russians continue to weave their web around Vuglidar and Kurakhovo. They continue to clear, I think that's the right word now, Krasnogorovka. And perhaps in the late summer, early autumn, the major battle for Vuglidar in this area will begin as well. So the Russians advancing everywhere along the front lines, and Ukrainians continue to suffer appalling losses and appalling losses in the air. Now, yesterday, I read an astonishing article, at least astonishing not in what it says, but in terms of who wrote it. An astonishing article by David Axe. He, to those who are unfamiliar with him, is a fervid supporter of Ukraine, somebody who puts a positive spin on every aspect of the war that Ukraine is fighting. Anyway, David Axe wrote an astonishing article in the Daily Telegraph acknowledging the massive success that the Russians have achieved over the last couple of days through their attacks on the Ukrainian air bases, the mass destruction of Sukhoi 27 fighter jets at the Mirnograd air base, the attacks on other air bases as well, which have done less but still substantial damage. And David Axe admitted that with the present state of things, the F-16s, as soon as they arrive on Ukrainian territory, look doomed. The Russians will destroy them in exactly the same way as they are destroying all the other Ukrainian aircraft as well. And then, of course, he would not be David Axe if he didn't go off on a frolic of his own, because he then spoke about the need to provide Ukraine with unlimited numbers of Patriot air defense missiles and other air defense systems in order to close Ukraine's skies to Russian drones, surveillance drones, cruise missiles, and those sort of things. He says, rather astonishingly, that Ukraine's air defense system is relatively intact, that the Russians have only destroyed around 160 out of the 400 batteries of air defense missiles with which Ukraine started the war. He doesn't say anything, by the way, about numbers of air defense interceptors, actual missiles. He doesn't say how many Ukraine had of those at the start of the war and how many are left. We know that Ukraine has been launching S-300 missiles at prodigious rates throughout the last 2 years, and we've no way of knowing how many of those are left, but the sense is not that many, just saying. Anyway, he seems to think that even though he claims that the original Ukrainian air defense system is intact, an absurd idea, by the way, that nonetheless, because of the size of the country, there isn't enough air defense systems to cover all of Ukrainian airspace effectively enough. And so many, many, many more air defense missiles, Patriot missiles, and other such things need to be deployed to Ukraine to close these gaps in the air defense shield. And of course, what David Axe does is that he completely ignores the fundamental problems of availability, which Brian Beletic in particular discusses with such skill. Because, as is always the way with people like David Axe, he appears to assume unlimited numbers of Patriot air defense missile interceptors. He seems to think that if Ukraine needs 1 or 2 or 10,000 or 20,000 Patriot missiles, the United States and the West can simply supply them. There is never any shortage in availability and supply. Even this is true, by the way, in every single sector of weapon systems. A couple of weeks ago, I remember the Czechs saying that over the course of June, Ukraine would receive 100,000 155 millimeter artillery shells from the European Union as a result of President Pavel's plan, a supposedly successful plan to buy these shells on the international arms market. I've already discussed how this plan actually has miscarried disastrously, but anyway, never mind. The point is, we're now in July. Ukraine was supposed to receive all those 100,000 shells in June, and today and yesterday and the day before, there were the usual complaints from the Ukrainians that they didn't have enough shells. So, anyway, always demand for more and more shells, more and more air defense missiles. Never any explanation from people like David Axe about where they will come from. Brian Beletic has pointed out that production of Patriot air defense missile interceptors is running at perhaps 600 a year, which is completely insufficient to meet Ukraine's needs, putting aside the needs of the United States itself and those of its other key allies. But I'm going to say this, even if Ukraine were to be supplied with, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 air defense Patriot systems over the next few months, which is, of course, impossible, it still wouldn't be enough to close all the gaps in coverage that David Axe is talking about. There simply aren't enough missiles in the world to do that. And the Patriot missile system itself suffers from all sorts of problems, which people like David Axe never seem to want to acknowledge. The Russians have repeatedly shown that they have the ability to defeat it. And if we're talking about the attacks on the air bases, these were conducted with Iskander-M missiles that the Ukrainians themselves admit the Patriots cannot intercept. But anyway, there we are. David Axe at least admits the problem, that the Russians can destroy all the aircraft, the F-16s, that have been destroyed to Ukraine. And the solution he comes up with is not a solution at all, because he wants to flood Ukraine with Patriot air defense missiles, which don't exist. So there we are. That is, in summary, the situation on the front lines. A situation getting worse for Ukraine every day. Now, you would have thought that the friends of Ukraine, so-called, want to prevent this deterioration from continuing. There is no means to stop this militarily. So why not do that which Viktor Orban is now doing, which is talk to the Russians? But oh no, Orban can't do that. We can't do that. That's absolutely out of the question. As Charles Michel says, if Viktor Orban talks to the Russians, he's only talking on his own behalf. He is not representing the West or anyone else in the West at all. This is dismal. It is disastrous. And of course, if in November the United States elects a different president, if Donald Trump is elected President of the United States, he of course has a good relationship with Orban, and perhaps President Trump, as he will then perhaps once again be, if he really does want to end the war in Ukraine, well, he can at least talk to Orban, who can tell him what the Russians, what Putin himself is thinking. So, a visit by Orban, which might turn out to be consequential, and which to me looks like the proper exercise of diplomacy. Well, there we are. Administration replacing government. The one political leader in the West who is making what I would call a serious governmental decision, Viktor Orban, gets criticized for it. Everybody else just wants to go on doing the same thing, even as that same thing visibly fails. What a dismal situation we are in. The only good thing to be said about it is what I said earlier in the program, that it is ultimately an unsustainable one. Anyway, This is where I end my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can check out our shop, buy yourself all the amazing things that you will find there, including our ongoing Football 24 series. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, if you've liked this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.